January 1986, Washington, D.C. A box of yellowing paper sits inside the National Archives. Nearly 300 pages. A file nobody was supposed to read too closely. A historian opens it, and the first sentence he reads will end up shaking a president 8,000 kilometers away. The Ang Mga Maharlika unit is fraudulent. For over 40 years, one man told the Filipino people he was a war hero, not just a soldier. The most decorated war hero in Philippine history. 32 medals. A guerrilla force of 9,000 men, hidden in the mountains of Luzon, sabotaging the Japanese, assassinating collaborators, saving lives. He used that story to win an election, to build a myth, to rule a country for 21 years. And the United States Army, the same army whose medals he claimed to wear, had concluded in writing decades earlier that almost none of it happened. This is the story of Ferdinand Marcos, not the dictator, not the Imelda-and-her-shoes headline you already know. This is the story of a 25-year-old man who came home from a war a prisoner, a fugitive, and the son of a Japanese collaborator, and somehow within 3 years, rewrote himself into a legend so convincing it took the United States government 4 decades and 1 revolution to unravel it. And here's the part that makes this more than just a lie. Some of the men who did claim membership in his unit, they weren't fighting the Japanese at all. The U.S. Veterans Administration later found that some men under the Maharlika name had been committing atrocities against Filipino civilians. A myth built partly on the backs of men accused of war crimes, worn like a medal for 40 years. So how does a man go from prisoner of war to fugitive, to the son of a collaborator the guerrillas executed, to the most decorated war hero in Philippine history? To understand how the lie was built, you have to go back to where it started, not in the mountains of Luzon, in a courtroom, years before the war even began, because Ferdinand Marcos was already someone the country had heard of, for a very different reason. Let's go back to the beginning. Ferdinand Marcos was born in 1917 in Sarat, a small town in Ilocos Norte. His father, Mariano Marcos, was a congressman and provincial governor. A political animal, well-connected, and well-known in the region. Ferdinand grew up watching how power actually worked in the provinces, not through speeches, through favors, alliances, and reputation. At the University of the Philippines, he trained in ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps. He was also a brilliant law student, sharp memory, sharp tongue. But before he ever saw a battlefield, Marcos became nationally famous for something else entirely, a murder trial, his own. In 1935, a rival of his father, a politician named Julio Nalundasan, was shot dead through a window. Marcos was the prime suspect. He was convicted of murder. And then, in one of the most talked about reversals in Philippine legal history, Marcos appealed his own case to the Supreme Court, argued it himself, and won. Acquitted. Before the war, before the medals, before the presidency. Ferdinand Marcos had already shown the country something about himself. He could be accused of the worst and talk his way out of it completely. That skill would matter more than anyone realized. Then came December 1941, Pearl Harbor. Within hours, Japan struck the Philippines too. Marcos, like thousands of young Filipinos with ROTC training, was activated into the United States Armed Forces in the Far East, USAFFE. He served through the brutal defense of Bataan, where American and Filipino troops held the line for months with dwindling food, ammunition, and medicine, buying time the Allies desperately needed elsewhere in the Pacific. When Bataan fell in April 1942, 80,000 men surrendered. Marcos was one of the prisoners marched out in what would become known as the Bataan Death March. A forced 65-mile walk under tropical heat with no food, no water, no mercy. Thousands died along the way. Marcos survived. And here is where his official story, the one he would tell for the rest of his life, starts to drift from the paper trail. He claimed he was released from the Japanese prison camp on August 4th, 1942. After that, his story goes, he vanished into the mountains of northern Luzon and built a guerrilla army from scratch. But there's a detail his official story leaves out. Documents uncovered decades later suggest the real reason for his release wasn't heroism. It was his father. Mariano Marcos, the congressman, the provincial governor, had begun cooperating with the Japanese occupation as a publicist, propaganda work, for the very army that was starving and executing his son's countrymen. It gets darker. By 1945, Filipino guerrillas, the real ones, fighting and dying in the hills, had marked Mariano Marcos as a collaborator. He was executed by a guerrilla unit that April. So picture the position Ferdinand Marcos was actually in 1942. Not a free man choosing heroism. A former POW, walking out of a Japanese camp, whose own father was working for the people who put him there. A young man with every reason in the world to need a different story. Fast. That's the real starting point, not a legend. A 25-year-old with a murder trial already behind him, a war collapsing around him, and a father whose name was about to become poison. What he built next, on paper, in affidavits, in a history he wrote about himself, would turn that liability into the foundation of a presidency. Here's how he did it. Sometime after his release, Marcos says he organized a guerrilla force called Ang Mga Maharlika, the nobles, or the freemen. According to him, it grew to 9,000 fighters across northern Luzon, sabotage operations, intelligence networks. Even he claimed political assassinations of collaborators. It's a story made for legend. A secret army, hidden in plain sight, fighting in the shadows while the rest of the country waited for MacArthur to return. There's a problem with it. When Marcos rejoined organized U.S. forces in December 1944, after the Americans landed back on Luzon, military records list him simply as a major in the 14th Infantry, USAFIPNL, not the commander of a 9,000-man army, a staff officer. His own commanding officers later testified that Marcos served as a non-combatant, a civil affairs officer, paperwork, not firefights. So right after the war, like thousands of other Filipino veterans, Marcos filed a claim with the U.S. Army, asking them to formally recognize Ang Mga Maharlika as a guerrilla unit. The reason mattered. Recognition meant back pay, benefits, honors. He submitted unit rosters, lists of names, a self-written history of the organization's exploits. He claimed his men had engaged in countless clashes with the Japanese across a vast stretch of Luzon. The army investigated, and the investigation did not go the way Marcos needed it to. An army officer named Captain Elbert R. Curtis reviewed the documents, cross-checked them against wartime intelligence reports, and reached a conclusion that would stay buried in the archives for 40 years. The unit roster was a fabrication. No such unit had ever existed in the way Marcos described. His claims were, in the Army's own words, fraudulent, preposterous, and a malicious criminal act. The Army denied his claim twice. The only men they ever did recognize were a small group, around 111, and only for limited support work they performed after the Americans had already landed in 1945, not for fighting the Japanese during the occupation years at all. And then there's the detail that turns this from exaggerated war story into something much darker. In 1950, the U.S. Veterans Administration, working with the Philippine Army, investigated people who had claimed membership under the Maharlika name. What they found wasn't heroism. Some of those individuals had been committing atrocities against Filipino civilians, not fighting the occupiers, preying on their own people, hiding behind a guerrilla name for cover. This is the moral knot at the center of this story. Marcos's own military records contain no direct evidence tying him personally to those atrocities. But the myth he built and kept building for decades gave cover to a name that, for at least some who wore it, meant violence against the very people it claimed to protect. A legend built on a lie. Standing next to crimes the legend never had to answer for. You'd think a formal U.S. Army rejection would end the story there. It didn't. Because Marcos wasn't done, not even close. By 1962, running for the Senate and building toward the presidency, Marcos didn't quietly drop the claim. He expanded it. He now declared himself the most decorated war hero in Philippine history. 27, then 32 medals, depending on who was counting. The Distinguished Service Cross, supposedly pinned on him by General Douglas MacArthur himself. The Medal of Honor, supposedly from General Jonathan Wainwright. None of it held up. Historians later found no record in MacArthur's actual list of recipients, matching Marcos's claims for guerrilla activity. The medals the U.S. did award him, a Silver Star, a Distinguished Service Cross listing, a Purple Heart, were tied to the January 1942 Bataan campaign, not to any guerrilla unit. Years later, researchers found official award databases didn't even list Major Marcos among the recipients of 3 of the medals his own government claimed he'd won. And when the records didn't exist to back him up, Marcos had an answer ready, the same skill he'd shown as a young man on trial for murder. Explain it away. He claimed the proof had been destroyed in a fire to protect wartime secrets. As president, with full control of the press, he had government newspapers run testimonials daily from veterans backing his story. He even, at one point, cited the supposed memoirs of Japanese Emperor Hirohito as proof that his unit was real. A claim that fell apart within a day when the Japanese source he cited said publicly he'd been misquoted, and that the Maharlika name he remembered wasn't a guerrilla army at all, just a small group caught distributing anti-Japanese leaflets. The lie held for over 40 years. Through a presidency, through martial law, through the imprisonment of his political rivals, some of whom dared question his war record publicly. One of his own former publicists, who later broke with him and claimed the guerrilla affidavits were forged using the names of dead soldiers, disappeared mysteriously after testifying against him in 1975. It finally cracked in January 1986. Weeks before an election that would end his rule, journalists got hold of the declassified army file. The New York Times published it. Fraudulent. Absurd. The exact words American investigators had written about him in the 1940s, finally read by the public, he had ruled for 2 decades. Weeks later, a peaceful uprising, the People Power Revolution, forced him from office and into exile. The myth that helped build a presidency didn't survive contact with the paper trail it had always been hiding from. So, hero or war criminal? The honest answer is neither label fits cleanly. Marcos wasn't convicted of war crimes himself, but he spent 40 years wearing the borrowed courage of men who actually fought and died in those mountains, while a name he controlled gave cover to people who did real harm to Filipino civilians. That's the legend, built by one of the most talented liars in Philippine political history, on a story almost nobody checked until it was far too late to matter. If you made it this far, you already know more about this than most Filipinos do. Drop a comment below. Hero, villain, or something in between. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. There's a lot more Philippine history they never taught you in school.